This is a rapid session. So the next one is your exclusive right to represent buyer's agreement. I'm going to try not to go over the same information twice, but so I'll kind of swing through some of this stuff. So of course the top on all these agreements is pretty much the same, right? Appointment of the broker, the buyer's representation. This just says that this is a buyer's representation agreement. 3 is the notice section. As I said on the previous agreement, make sure you fill this section out. The terms, how long is this term going to last? Like I said, I like to do these for at least 90 days as well. I don't normally charge an early termination fee on buyer-broker agreements. It's hard enough to get a buyer to sign these agreements as it is. 5 goes into the broker's duties. This pretty much is the same as the listing, just the opposite side for the buyer. On paragraph 5, you have a list of duties. A is perform the terms of this brokerage agreement. B, seek a property at a price and terms acceptable to the buyer. That can be impossible sometimes, right? C, presenting in a timely manner all written offers or counteroffers to and from the buyer. D, disclose to the buyer all material facts related to the property or concerning the transaction of which you have actual knowledge. E, account for any monies in a timely manner. So this kind of outlines what we're supposed to do. I'm going to kind of peruse through this real quick because I just really want to hit on one thing here. Down near the bottom of page, because this is a question I get a lot of times. And I'm going to start where it says, in addition, broker may show the same property to other buyers. So if you have a buyer's agreement and you have multiple buyers, you can show the same property to multiple buyers. Representing other buyers on the same or different properties, represent seller relative to other properties, or provide assistance to a seller or prospective seller by performing ministerial acts that are not in consistence with the broker duties under this agreement. So if your buyer finds a for sale by owner, this agreement covers you as well. Number 6 is the buyer's duties. So the buyer has responsibility as well. They're going to work exclusively. Oh, go ahead.
So I have a question. When do you typically have a potential buyer sign this, as most people don't want to feel fenced in for 90 days?
Well, in regards to a buyer, right, the state law says that anytime you engage in substantive conversation regarding real estate transaction with your buyer, you should have an agency agreement in place. So, so your buyers all the time want to talk about, say they find a property or they start asking you comps. I'm going to use comps for instance. Once you start drafting comps for a buyer, you have entered into substantial conversations with that buyer. You're providing real estate service, and by law, you are required to do a buyer agency agreement. Now, of course, I've been doing this a while, right? So a lot of the business that I do is referral. So I don't have to sit there, I have to sell myself, but I don't have to sit there a lot of times to talk them into signing a 90-day agreement. But if I'm meeting a buyer for the first time ever, I'm at an open house, I meet a buyer at an open house, they decide they're not interested in my listing, but they enjoyed the conversation with me, they say, hey Steve, we'd like you to represent us as a buyer. They may not want to sign a 90-day agreement. I may sign them up for a lower agreement time, 30 days, 21 days, 14 days, so that they can get used to me, see what services I'm gonna provide to them, and they don't feel handcuffed for a long period of time. So you don't have to do a 90-day agreement. You can do anything less than that. But I would say anytime you get involved in substantial conversations with a buyer about property that a real estate professional would be giving to a buyer, you should have a buyer agency agreement in place. Number 6 is buyer's duties. So the buyer shall A, work exclusively with the broker, B, pay the broker directly or indirectly as the compensation, and C, comply with reasonable requests by the broker to supply financial and personal data, and D, be available during broker's regular working hours. So whatever your regular working hours are, your buyer has to somewhat accommodate. Yes, sir.
So back to that same point, if they don't want to sign one at all, should we get something in writing that says that?
Well, it depends on what the buyer is asking you to do. If your buyer doesn't, I mean, Virginia law, it's Virginia law. So if your buyer is looking for representation and they don't want to sign an exclusive right to be represented, how do you provide them the real estate services in order to do that if the law requires you to have an agreement, brokerage agreement with that person in place? So yeah, you can do certain things in order to help them out, but if you don't have a brokerage agreement in place and you're going to write an offer for the buyer, who do you represent at that time? Well, do you represent the seller? Are you writing the offer as representative of the seller because you have no brokerage agreement with the buyer? So it's really, you as an agent have to be insightful and forceful enough to make the buyer understand that I'm required by law to, before I write an offer for you or before I have these type of conversations with you, to have a brokerage agreement in place with you. That's just the law. There's no way around it. It's not a, hey, you can sign it if you want it. Hey, I can do all this stuff and have you sign it at the end. And then, of course, when you go to settle and you don't have one and they don't want to sign it, you're in kind of a predicament, right? So it's always best to have it signed up front. And like I said, I mean, what's wrong? Okay, you're going to write an offer you meet someone today, they want to write an offer today. You write a 1 day or a 3 day brokerage agreement. It covers you. It's not that hard. And you know, that would be my recommendation. I've never had a problem getting someone to sign. Next is purpose. Here you would write in whatever the purpose is that your buyer is looking for. Now, I'm working in Northern Virginia. I would write I would write something like residential property in Northern Virginia, or residential property in, Fairfax, Loudoun, whatever counties. So you can be as detailed or as general as possible. I mean, you could write all residential property in Virginia. If you want to drive all the way to Charlottesville for your buyer, you could write all residential property in Virginia and drive to Charlottesville. But I would write all residential property in Northern Virginia. That way, if your buyer switches gear halfway through it and decides that they want to go to Charlottesville, they can go find an agent in Charlottesville and look at property at Charlottesville and they could get a buyer-broker agreement down there and have one up here. Number 8, compensation. If you're going to get a retainer fee, you would put it in here. Once again, that check would be made payable to Sampson Properties. B is what everyone has a problem with because I've seen these agreements that are blank, have 0, have NA. I would be careful here because you're really setting up what you're getting entitled to be paid here. So the buyer shall pay compensation in the amount of, and I like to use the term, say 2.5%, or as per the MRIS, plus $345. So the $345, as you know, covers that brokerage fee. If I put 2.5% plus or as per MRIS, that covers me whether or not my client looks at a property that's in the MLS, or I'm showing them FSBOs or whatever property is out there currently that I can find for them. That way they understand that they are on the hook. I mean, in reality, you want the buyer to understand that you're getting paid in most cases through the MRIS, but you are working for them. We like to give the false impression to our buyers that this is going to cost them nothing, that our services are free, but they're not really free. I mean, somebody is paying for them. I mean, if you really want to get down to brass taxes, right? The seller is paying the commission, but who's paying the seller? The buyer. So is the buyer paying us? Yes. So, I mean, in reality, you don't need to sugarcoat it. I mean, if if you're buying services or if you're having services performed for you, the expectation is that you have to pay for them. So make sure that you write that in and don't put NA. I know it says down here that if you get paid, that you get paid through MRIS or whatever, but it just sets the wrong tone, in my opinion. So if you put in the amount, it says to broker, if buyer enters into a contract to acquire real property during the term of this agreement, it goes to settle on the contract at any time. In most cases, seller pays the brokerage fees, but in the event the seller does not pay any or all of the amount due, buyer hereby agrees to pay any of the remaining brokerage fees due to the buyer broker. Broker may retain any additional compensation offered to the seller or seller's representative if this causes the compensation paid to the broker to exceed the fee above. So write that in. And then the broker fee shall be earned, due and payable to the broker under either of the following circumstances. 1, if within 30 days of any expiration of the buyer's or termination, they enter into an agreement. So I would say 30 days, right? And then if having entered into an enforceable contract to acquire real estate during the term of this agreement, buyer defaults under the term. So if your buyer defaults on a contract, theoretically the company or you could go after them for compensation as well. Number 9 is relocation program. Same thing as applies from the previous agreement. If they are part of a relocation program, it needs to be disclosed to you. Number 10 are the types of representation. So seller representation, we all know what that is, right? Buyer's representation, designated representation, the same things here hold true that's in the listing agreement. So you want to be able to show other Sampson listings. So of course you want your buyer to agree to consent to designated representation. And then dual representation, like I said, I don't ever act as a dual agent, so I always check the box that the buyer does not consent. Number 11, complies with fair housing. This just kind of goes over and says that you have to comply with fair housing. Number 12 is attorney's fees. This lets the buyer know that if they need an attorney or if they're going to breach this agreement, their attorney's fees are not covered under this agreement. 13, whether or not the buyer holds an active real estate license or an inactive license. 14 are the disclaimers. Megan's Law is in here. Wire fraud, as we talked about in the listing agreement, is in here as well. And service provider referrals. This just lets the buyer or the people know that you're sending referrals this way, but you're not really, if you're giving them a referral for certain things, it's letting them know that you're not endorsing them or guaranteeing anything or their workmanship. That kind of holds you, kind of not liable for that. But a lot of times when I'm giving referrals, I normally give more than one contractor or more than one service provider. That way the buyer or the seller have to choose one of those people. Miscellaneous, once this agreement is signed by all parties, it's enforceable. And then the last page is the signature page. And once again, fill out the buyer, agent, contact information, and supervising broker. Now, a lot of times what I see on these agreements too is, and I would recommend not doing it, is a lot of people hold these agreements until they get a ratified contract. Don't wait until you get a ratified contract to get this enforced. You don't want to, or signed by a broker. You don't want to be sitting there and find out at the last minute your buyer went off to another agent and wrote a contract on a listing that you showed them. And then the first question that a broker is going to ask you is, do you have a signed buyer-broker agreement? And if it's signed by the buyer and not a broker, it's not enforceable, right? So it has to be signed by all parties and then returned to the buyer or the listing or the seller in order for this document to be enforceable. All right, any questions on that agreement? All right. Gotta love it.